Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce the final panel of the day, which is arguably going to debate one of the most important questions of this first day. Panel 5 is what's happening in Xinjiang Genocide. So I'm delighted to welcome as our esteemed chair, Professor Anthony Dirk Moses from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And enormous thanks to Professor Moses for flying all the way over from the US, also to Erin ROSENBERG, who sat beside him, who's also flown over, braving a hurricane to do so. So yeah, very, very many thanks.
Okay, I'm being recorded, I can hear that. Welcome everyone to the final panel of the day before the Interfaith Solidarity, then of course the dinner. This panel goes from 5:15 to 6:30, and I've been instructed to be exacting with the time. We have 4 panelists, one up on the screen, Magnus from Cornell University, FISKESJÖ, and we have 12 minutes each, and we'll be speaking in the order of the program. So I introduce now Magnus FISKESJÖ, who will be speaking on, from Cornell University, will be speaking on genocide and cultural genocide in China. Over to you.
I trust that you can hear me. I want to start by thanking the organizers. I am very happy to be part of the conference and very sad that I cannot join you in Newcastle. When I teach on the genocides in China and Burma here at Cornell University, I found that the concept of genocide, wiping out a people as such, can be hard to grasp for students. And I imagine this is partly because Americans and the Chinese, being very numerous in the hundreds of millions, perhaps have a harder time imagining that their people and their language and culture could be wiped out as such, that they would be no more, that English or Chinese would no longer be spoken in this world. For me personally, coming from a nation of only 10 million people, Sweden, less numerous than the Uyghurs, it is readily imaginable. And we know history is littered with examples of peoples that don't exist anymore because they were precisely wiped out and forcibly assimilated away, as is now happening in China. I believe the evidence accumulating since 2017 shows that the Chinese regime is indeed intentionally pursuing the goal of eradicating the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, and the other people of the Xinjiang region or East Turkestan by direct destruction and by forced assimilation both. The proof is both in the regime's actions and in its own statements about its goals, euphemistic as they often may be, about a unified nation in harmony, but with no room for distinct minorities, who shall be amalgamated, Ronghe, into a unified Chinese-dominated nation state. At times, those statements have been less euphemistic, as in the public insistence in 2020 that the current policies in Xinjiang are totally correct. And just last week, the public visit on August 24th by the Communist Party leader to a shrine outside Beijing, Puningsi, that celebrates the Zhangarian genocide, a Chinese Imperial Army atrocity, one of the worst mass killings in all of world history, comparable to the Roman destruction of Carthage, but now in China evoked as illustrating the neo-nationalist goal of Chinese unity with due precedent in China's history as an empire. In the Genocide Convention that we have on the books of international law since 1948, there are 5 acts that identify genocide when coupled with the destructive goal and intent. Meeting only one of them is enough for the crime to apply, but I believe it's clear the Chinese regime has already met all 5. As for A, killings, we know that the Xinjiang camps target specific ethnic groups and that many detainees have died in the camps from torture, from medical neglect, or starvation. Even if we have no evidence yet of industrial scale mass extermination. Of course, even in Hitler's case, evidence of mass killings didn't come to light until late in the story. That's worth remembering. As for B, causing serious bodily or mental harm, indeed, the mass arbitrary detention of people, likely between 1 and 2 million of them, causes serious bodily and mental harm to all those detainees and to society as a whole, since it forces everyone to live in fear. C, bringing about conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I think both the systematic vast forced labor system to which many detainees have been transferred, and also the closing and confiscation of Uyghur business should be mentioned there. As for D, prevent births, and the last E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, these are clearly documented as well and have rightly been taken as clinch in the case of this Chinese genocide specifically. By the way, note that D and E do not appear among the crimes against humanity in the Rome Statute of the ICC. A mass killings and such can be committed without genocidal intent, but the ethnically targeted prevention of births, mass sterilizations, and the targeted confiscation of children from Uyghur families cannot be explained other than as driven by genocidal intent. So they serve to underline that very intent. Now, it is true, the term genocide is burdened by the widespread popular misunderstanding that the crime of genocide is somehow limited to mass killings done in the Nazi style. To take just one example, the Republican former governor of Indiana wrote in the Washington Post in July that true genocide means the mass slaughter of an entire people. He's wrong, of course. He's probably harking back to 1950s American fears that anti-Black lynchings would be labeled genocide under the new convention. But he's also lazy for not looking up the formal definition that the world's nations agreed upon in 1948. I presume it's also because of this long-running misunderstanding, a popular misunderstanding, that even some scholars have preferred to call the events in China either mass atrocities, ethnocide, or cultural genocide, often leaving the terms undefined as if they were self-explanatory. Some even, which is strange to me, have sought to place the discussion of the crime of genocide in opposition to the deployment of analytic frameworks that could help explain why this crime is being committed, such as settler colonialism and imperialism, which indeed are playing out on China's new frontier, again in close continuity with the empires of the past. For me, it has been helpful to review the specific history and conceptualization of the term coined by Raphael Lemkin, who grew up in what Timothy Snyder has described as the Bloodlands, the parts of Europe ravaged by both Stalin and Hitler. Lemkin saw clearly that acts like burning synagogues, burning books, and also disappearing the writers of those books were part and parcel of what he called genocide. To erase a people from the face of the earth, previously a crime without a name. When he coined the new term in 1944, he wrote, "The actions involved are directed against individuals not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national group." This is the conceptual origin of the convention's key phrase, the group as such. And this is what we see China's government targeting. I also believe that in addition to the convention's 5 acts, the Chinese regime's destructive actions in the cultural arena are similarly designed to block the transmission and inheritance of culture so that, even in the absence of mass killings, they can eradicate these groups as such, because if there is a next generation, it will be Chinese instead. With this cultural erasure, Uyghurs will have nothing to lean on to sustain themselves as such into the future. But as the convention was being formulated in 1947-48, the former European colonial powers, France, the UK, Canada, Sweden, and others, refused to include cultural erasure in the convention's definition of genocide, primarily because they were themselves guilty of such erasure in their former possessions and did not want this brought up. Their opposition was the mirror image of how the Soviet side refused to own up to targeting social groups, which is why the term social is also missing in that paragraph 2 of the convention. The original idea for an Article 3, if it had not been deleted, would have read, in this convention, genocide also means any deliberate act committed with the intent to destroy the language, religion, or culture of a national, racial, or religious group, on the grounds of the origin of belief of its members, such as prohibiting the use of the language of the group in daily intercourse or in schools, or the printing and circulation of publications in the language of the group, destroying or preventing the use of libraries, museums, schools, historical monuments, places of worship, or other cultural institutions. But this was deleted. As a result, it can seem that today the Chinese government systematic campaign doing all those things as part of its genocide grand design, the bulldozing of mosques and monuments, the closing of bookstores, the prohibiting the Uyghur language in school, the mass arrests of poets and singers, it can seem that those are not explicitly part of genocide, as the convention spells it out, except sideways in how the Article 2 says, whole or in part, which probably represent an intentional survival of Lemkin's concern with cultural figures. When not killing everyone, killing or silencing those figures that carry the culture forward can achieve the same goal. And of course, additionally, in how the Indian school-style genocidal policy survives in paragraph 2E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. All the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which lists this does list as a war crime intentionally directing attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and so on. Even though this paragraph has actually only been used very recently in 2016 for the first time, when the International Criminal Court convicted an Islamist militia leader in Mali who had attacked mausoleums and an ancient mosque in the city of Timbuktu in Mali, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Interestingly, the judge declared that this verdict should have a deterrent effect on others tempted to carry out similar acts in Mali or elsewhere. This was in late 2016, just as the Chinese government was about to launch its own, much more massive genocidal campaign. The allocations of funds had been set, the key genocide henchmen such as Chen Chengguo, Zhu Hailun, they were already in place to lead the campaign. I think in our present situation, instead of waiting for the future perfection of international laws, we should seize upon what's available. We should be demanding that the United Nations courts and agencies like the High Representative for Human Rights open formal investigations into what is obviously a genocide. And that should include both the aspects that survived in the convention and the systematic Chinese destruction of Uyghur and other native cultures detailed in other presentations today. This is very much alive as a body of unequivocal evidence for genocidal intent as specified in the convention, and we should seize upon that in condemning, prosecuting, and seeking to halt the genocide. I recently, in a different article in Cultural Property News, argued for this point, agreeing with the British Parliament's conclusion to the same effect. And what is even more interesting is recently the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court issued an important new policy on cultural heritage that states precisely this point. As a new policy for ICC prosecution, it says, crimes against cultural heritage occurring simultaneously with other acts targeting protected groups may provide evidence of the specific intent required for genocide. Yes, indeed. And further, acts that are directed specifically against the group's cultural heritage may assist to demonstrate specific intent and the manifest pattern as required for genocide. So this initiative, I think, in effect has closed the broken circle of Lemkin's total concept of genocide, which survived in the as such definition of the convention and can now be supported by evidence for cultural erasure as well. It's also clear that China's government is violating what they themselves explicitly promised in the Human Rights Council at the UN in 2016, the same year, with the resolution that they signed on to cultural rights and the protection of cultural heritage, which condemns all acts of destruction of cultural heritage, as well as the violation or abuse of the right of everyone to take part in cultural life, including the ability to access and enjoy cultural heritage. We realize that this is being blatantly violated in Xinjiang. But it's not important how China's government is lying and obfuscating, or that it's tried to put itself beyond the reach of the international courts or block their action, or that even as a member state in the Genocide Convention, China never bothered to write a convention into domestic law as is required for member states. What is important is that Genocide Plus is being committed. The world has an obligation to react, not only convention member states. We all must indict and demand that the world indicts China for this genocide. I believe the UN and others should also end the empty talk about visiting Xinjiang. We all know this would only result in a futile, heavily staged spectacle, which would be used to make a mockery of the UN itself. Instead, I believe the UN agencies should launch formal fact-gathering operations in preparation for later prosecution. I think it's most important to notice that even the threat of such prosecution can have the effect of halting the genocide by way of ending impunity, threatening to end impunity.
David, sorry, Magnus, you have to wrap up, mate.
2004, about the prevention of genocide, that we have little hope of preventing genocide or reassuring those who live in fear of its recurrence if people who have committed this most heinous of crimes are left at large and not held to account. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next speaker is David Tobin from the University of Manchester. The title of his paper is Anti-Colonial Genocide in Xinjiang. David, the floor is yours.
Gratitude and respect to Joe and Hannah for all their hard work. Thank you very much in organising such an important event. As you'll see, my title has actually changed. So I'm shifting on to look at the long-term processes of genocide in the region. Really, I'm trying to historicise how long-term identity narratives shape recent ethnic policy shifts and their impact. Now, Xi Jinping's statement at the National People's Congress that cultural identity is the deepest identity and the soul of every ethnic group is often taken to represent a shift from ethnic policy, from nominal cultural pluralism, defining China as 56 equal ethnic groups, towards fusion, Jiaorong, an assimilation model into Zhonghua Minzu. Of course, Jiaorong is not Xi Jinping's idea. It's an old Chinese idea that was critiqued as a form of chauvinism in the 1950s and even westernization. So the simple question I suppose we're addressing in this panel is, does fusion policy constitute genocide? My complicated answer is that fusion seeks to promote China's Great Revival and resolve what it calls the ethnic problem through social death of Turkic-speaking Muslims. Planned annihilation of Turkic identities has been unrecognised as genocide, partly because it builds on persistent colonial logics in global politics, i.e. that we still conceptualise peoples as backward and modern, inferior and superior, and we consider identities as authentic and inauthentic, i.e. some peoples are superfluous because they do not contribute to the goals of the state. This has also been unrecognised as genocide because of China's official narrative, the CCP's narrative that it is non-Western, that this policy is non-Western, that its multi-ethnic composition of China's history is specifically non-Western because the West uses one nation, one state thinking, and that's conceived as a form of colonial violence. But of course, this policy now is being presented as a form of colonial violence by the older historical materialists that thought China should remain 56 ethnic groups. So post-colonial study shows there's nothing peculiarly Western about colonialism or genocide. This comes up in the Xi's narrative, such as this, we need to sinicize religion. This is, of course, a form of colonization, but it's presented as a form of decolonization. It's to eliminate Uyghur backwardness, which is seen as a result of Western interference in the 19th century, and to transform that inauthentic identity that supposedly Uyghurs are simply colonial manipulations and historical leftovers of an earlier era. So that's why I use this phrase anti-colonial genocide, not because it's good or we shouldn't oppose colonialism, but simply that this resisting Western colonialism in this narrative has reframed Uyghurs as inauthentic and the colonial manipulation that can be seen as superfluous. So in some ways it resembles colonial genocide that Joe Smith-Finley's pointed out in a recent article. There's David maybe Lewis's term, where genocides are based on land seizures, forced labour and cultural annihilation. We've seen this with the arrival of the Bingtuan in Xinjiang, quote, the slogan turning pasture land into farms, i.e. moving Kazakhs who are nomads from their land, and essentially a form of cultural annihilation in collective farms. And of course the slogan with plough in one hand and gun in the other. So it was a militarised form of development. But this form of genocide also resembles each of Daniel Fairstein's 4 types: constituent, colonial, post-colonial and reorganising, because it's based on long-term imperial state building, the notion that Uyghurs are barbarians, they're simply to be absorbed and attracted to Chinese civilization, that shifts to post-colonial insecurity under the CCP, that the West and Russia are a threat and want to separate Xinjiang from China, and now a sort of a deliberate reorganisation of indigenous identities through camps and intergenerational separation. So that anti-colonial genocide captures the intended resistance and paradoxical intent of fusion policies explained as securing the Great Revival to overcome China's colonial humiliation, but it tragically repeats the same mistakes as colonialism by framing Uyghurs as historical leftovers and a superfluous people. So really framing genocide as planned and permissive processes of social death by attrition. This is drawing from the critical genocide studies literature. Don't have time to go through it all, but if we look to Helen Fine, came up with the concept of genocide by attrition, meaning that genocides are slow, it's not a rapid descent into barbarism, and points specifically to the Warsaw Ghetto. What happened in the Warsaw Ghetto happened before deportations, before the final solution, permissively preventing supplies and energy reaching people and allowing them to die. This is a form of genocide today, we would consider. But really this idea of social death that I'm really using from Claudia Card to reframe genocide as something not specifically physical. So I'm interested in things that are considered only, quote, cultural genocide, things that seem benign, inevitable, i.e. modernisation. But as Claudia Card says, the experience of loss of community and loss of meaning and loss of connection, and this happens through family separation, that can be as bad as it can feel as bad, and it can be as traumatic as physical torture. Claudia Card points to Raphael Lemkin's original definition of genocide put on the board. Really, Raphael Lemkin meant that genocide is always cultural. It's specifically about annihilating a national group. When he said it was about destroying a group in whole or in part, he didn't mean part as in a specific number of people, he means parts of the national life of the community, in this case, i.e. language and religion. Because he critiqued what happened at the Genocide Convention deliberations at the UN, because it refused to use notions that would be considered only cultural genocide in the face of total war, with the rise of fascism in Europe. This was seen as logically inconsistent to put these two together. But what this has done is given us a sort of input of physical bias into how we view these issues. So we didn't use the terms genocide until there was issues of sterilisation, physical destruction. Of course, living in Xinjiang, Uyghurs will talk about colonialism and assimilation for a long time. But this definition of genocide also sort of de-escalates the moral urgency of violence that does not threaten state sovereignty. It's not seen as a global emergency because it does not threaten pre-existing borders. Okay, so fusion as a form of social death. I mean, bear in mind that Hu Jintao was the first to say when the violence between Uyghurs and Han broke out in 2009, the first Xinjiang Working Group meeting. This slogan, contact, communication, fusion, was the result of that when Wang Yang had said we need to rethink ethnic policy or there will be problems. Of course, fusion wasn't a new idea. It's an idea that was circulating in the 1950s. Anthropologists debated it. Jianbo Zhan said it was westernization and chauvinism, and it would lead to China doing what the West has done to indigenous people. During that period of the Hu era, textbooks would describe the Han, this is the ethnic unity textbooks that were used following the violence for cadres, but also in schools. They describe the Han as a transcendent means, so they're the sort of post-culture. They can absorb other groups because they're culturally neutral and advanced, whilst describing Uyghur identity as an historical leftover. The peaceful liberation, as it's called, is framed as something that's done by the Central Plains. It's something that's described as happening long term since the Han Dynasty, not just since 1949, through this ancient notion, supposedly ancient notion of Tunken Wenhua. It's basically settler, open the frontier to settle it, culture. And in these narratives, it's a very binary view. Describes the relationship between frontier and Central Plains, where the Central Plains provide the frontier with everything they need for living in a complementary economy. But then we fast forward to Xi Jinping's era, and in a sense, he's dropped the contact and communication and focused purely on the fusion and uses the metaphor of a furnace, smelting people in a furnace. And by the 19th Party Congress, his speeches contain almost no reference to Xiaoshuominzu, ethnic minority, except when talking about cadre recruitment. And that concept, Xiaoshuominzu, is something that prior to that was essentially structured all these narratives between, Fei Xiaotong said the first task of the ethnic classification project is to decide who's Han and who's minority. The regional autonomy law since 1949 has described its purpose as resolving the ethnic problem and means a winty to modernize Xinjiang and its peoples, using the same language of colonial genocides to frame this process as culturally neutral, elimination of languages and religion as something to do with modernization. Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping both referred to Han's special responsibility in Xinjiang to develop the region because they're culturally superior. I can see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to fast forward through the next slide. I will pause just to say this is the type of evidence I was trying to use to say that this is reasons why we've missed calling this genocide, because many of the violent practices that we're seeing in child separation and internment camps are framed as positive, benevolent forms of modernization and transformation to actually help people become Chinese and become more modern. It's a violent form of inclusion. So the way what the camps have done is really created the notion that everything is possible. Arbitrary extra-legal selection deprives groups of essentially what Hannah Arendt called the right to rights. So this is part of a larger project that I've been doing, so diaspora interviews I'm doing, most are saying, you know, this not knowing what has happened to your family, the disconnection, just even if you don't know that, is being framed as a form of torture and trauma in itself, a form of social death because they're disconnected from social meaning, and it parallels what David Maybriel-Lewis called the suicidal despair of indigenous peoples. We interviewed Aziz Azah, who'd made the film An Unanswered Telephone Call about not being able to speak to his mother. When we talked about this policy, he said they don't use machine guns or gas chambers, they believe they can do anything. The aim is to make you mentally ill. So he wasn't really saying, he's focusing on whether it does or does not eradicate people, it's just the trauma that it causes. This piece of art, I will just sum up quickly, by Yi Xiaochuo, formerly anonymous artist. She says this represents the perpetual silence, stigma, and representational violence the Xinjiang person always has to face alone. The body is overwhelmed and identity is overwhelmed by these official narratives. These are not new. Xi, Western regions, East Turkestan, ethnic minority, sexy, exotic little sister. These are things that she has experienced since childhood. Okay, so just to conclude, social death circulates in Xinjiang through language of attraction to China, modernization and fusion. Camps and child separation isolate peoples as a threat, but they also include them but as inferior forms of Chinese, as barbarians to be absorbed. And the party state is adapting sovereignty as a right to genocide. UK embassy cites as criticism of these policies as disrespect for modernization of the Chinese people, the same language of colonialism. And fusion really is a semantically hybrid idea. It's not Chinese, this is using Western and Chinese ideas together, trying to reverse 19th century humiliation with humiliation of Turkic peoples in the 21st.
Thank you, David. The next speaker is Rune Steenberg from the Palatsky University, Czech Republic. The title of his paper is Mass Incarceration, Xinjiang in a Global Perspective, Metaphors, Propaganda and Context.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And a special thanks to Joe and Hannah and the whole team for organizing this and making it such a pleasant experience of a first conference in person after COVID. I'm really happy to be here and to see a lot of you. I have changed my presentation a bit just because I've been thinking along the same lines, and also in order to fit it better into the panel, and maybe also to provoke a bit of a discussion. I want to stress that I am here not to advocate a general point, but to open up a discussion that I think is direly needed and that is lacking at the moment in relation to the atrocities happening in Xinjiang. How do I switch this one? Okay, great. So basically what my talk's going to be about is I'm going to ask the question whether we should call the atrocities happening in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, or the Uyghur homelands genocide, and I will answer it with no. I'll explain why that is, and then I will, if time allows, give a short introduction into the analytical terms that I think we should be using instead. So, oh, sorry, that's me. It's a bit difficult to have this on here. It can't be switched, can it? Like move this up somehow? Okay, fine. It's just, yeah, no, that's fine. So my basic three arguments for not using the term genocide for the atrocities going on in Xinjiang or East Turkestan is that this is not the way it's been used. It's not the established way it's been used. And I know that a lot of you are arguing we shouldn't use it in the established way, that is, in the way of mass killings. But right now, that is how it is being used, and how the moral condemnation also reflects, or that is, it reflects this type of moral condemnation. And I'm not saying we can't call it that, but if we do, we need to take the full consequences and also apply it to other contexts that we so far have not called genocide. And one of the reasons of that is that the term is being used right now in a geopolitical, geostrategical war or Cold War or whatever we want to call it. And we are supporting one side in that quite strongly, a side that has committed a lot of human rights violations, a lot of terrible, I would also call crimes against humanity, just in this century alone. And I think that is highly problematic to make ourselves basically a tool in that game. Now, the second reason, I wouldn't call it that, is that I don't feel that the evidence is there to support even the UN Genocide Convention definition of it. If we do indeed use that and thus change the at least international political use so far of the term genocide, which has been used, as far as I have been able to see, almost exclusively, especially from the side of the United States, for mass killings. If we change that and we use the UN convention definition, I still don't think that the evidence is there to call it that, and I will, if time allows, go into as much detail as I can in order to explain why that is. Now, even if that is the case, quite a few people have argued we should still call it that, just because it has an effect. It has an effect for the advocacy of the Uyghurs to maybe stop what is going on right now, and so on and so forth. I do understand that argument, and I can definitely understand that Uyghur diaspora organizations are pushing for this recognition because their suffering and their genuine, terrible suffering has hardly been recognized at all for decades by the quote-unquote international community, meaning basically everybody outside of the Uyghur community. And I do understand that this is a good term to use. If I look at it from a scientific, academic perspective, in the sense of staying truthful and staying trustworthy in the eyes of the world and of our colleagues, I don't think we can allow to use a term like this if we don't have the evidence to back it up, even though it might short-term create a positive, in our view, political situation. Because what it does is takes us away, and this is what I see in the media discourses, but also increasingly in the scholarly discourses on the term genocide. It brings us to a point where we start interpreting evidence, interpreting facts, interpreting numbers in a certain direction with a certain bias. It takes us away from understanding of nuances. Things are being misinterpreted, I think, in a certain direction, and certain new information that comes into the discourse is not being seen, is not being applied, is not being discussed, and we don't have a source critical debate about what we're looking at. We've even created a situation where people are afraid to speak out publicly when they don't follow the, what I would call, established, especially US, but more and more Western narrative on these issues. And I think that's a problem. I'm not sure where to have this discussion, have this debate. I do think there's a problem with having it in complete public, because the nuances and the critique that will be aimed at one or the other scholar or media outlet reporting on the situation in Xinjiang can be used by people who do not have the truth in mind, who do not strive to basically really understand what is going on. And the Chinese government, of course, is the main actor there and the main perpetrator, and their distortion of the truth and what's going on is definitely worse still, luckily, than what we see in Western press and from Western governments. But we are in many ways also moving quite far away from an understanding of the truth. I want to point out, so yeah, basically, so far, very often, there's a dichotomy of pro-China versus anti-China, or China versus the West. I would really like to get away from that and instead look at reporting or analysis that is committed to truth and universal. That means also global justice, and political instrumentalization of data on the other hand. Because I think, of course, the Chinese government is very much on the side of political instrumentalization, but unfortunately, quite a few other governments are too, and also research institutes, think tanks, and so on and so forth are veering in that direction. So I want to make very clear that I do think grave atrocities have happened and are happening in Xinjiang or East Turkestan. I have myself done research in the region from 2010 to 2016, and after that in the Uyghur diaspora, and I've heard heartbreaking, terrible, terrible stories. I am very sure, or I know of a lot of these atrocity and human rights violations that we have seen in the region. Now, when I still want to argue that I wouldn't use the term genocide, it is, and this was my first argument, how much time do I have still? Okay. That the established use and the way it's been used so far, and the way it's been used politically, includes mass killings. And it's been used very carefully. The United States has only designated 6 genocides since the Holocaust. The Rohingya is not one of them. And they all include mass killings. Even in Rwanda, the US was very late to designate it a genocide because of the consequences it entails. And the consequences it entails is to try to stop it by all means. Right now, the US has designated what's going on in Xinjiang a genocide, but they're not trying to stop it with all means. Not at all. There's still negotiations going on. There's a lot of trade. It's really, it's blurred. And so basically what I want to say is that in this sense, that if we choose the second definition according to the Genocide Convention, and some of the things I've heard today are very reasonable in that direction, I think it's a good idea to at least call this kind of sneaking eradication of culture, of language, something. I do think, as Dave pointed out, it's very connected to modernity, but it doesn't have to be the only type of modernity. But if we do choose that, I think we need to give up the strongest possible condemnation side of it and recognize that, as some of you have already done here in this room, a lot of our own governments have been part to that, have been implicated in it, and that there are things going on in other places that are supported by some of our government that are comparably terrible. One of the reasons I started thinking along these lines was that I was so shocked that the Palestinian authorities supported China in their policies in Xinjiang in front of the UN Human Rights Convention in 2018. But since, I've also seen a lot of Uyghurs supporting Israel and the move of the US Embassy to Jerusalem, and I understand both sides of it. I just think that we as scholars need to provide a dialogue and a discourse that does not have either of those two blind spots. So in wrapping up, I'm not going to be able to go into this now. I think one of the most problematic parts, yes, I will wrap up now, is to prove intent. And I do think that, for instance, in the New Lines report, the way their proof of intent quotes the New York Times, but and doesn't go into the actual sources behind it, but misquotes it, in my understanding, is highly problematic. There are a lot of other things that are not being discussed that are highly problematic, seen from an academic perspective, and I think we need to have a source-critical discussion about these things. One of the things is also there's a lot of evidence out there that is not being presented to more than a handful of people, and there is a tendency to control the narrative from Chinese side, definitely, but I see more and more also a tendency to control the narrative from the other side. All right, I will wrap up here and hope that the next days will give us some opportunity to discuss some of the details here, to take the discussion further, and to have a developing, honest debate about the conceptual framework and also the actual facts on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The final speaker is Erin Farrell Rosenberg, who's a senior fellow at the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights. The title of her paper is The Intent to Destroy in Part under Article 2D of the Genocide Convention. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Joe and Newcastle University and all of the organizers. I'm going to actually clarify or expand on my background. It is true that I am a senior fellow at the Urban Morgan Human Rights Institute. However, for the past 10 years, my career and what I do is I am a practitioner of international criminal law, beginning on the Ratko Mladic genocide case at the ICTY and spending 9 years at the International Criminal Court working for Chambers. So I am not actually an academic or a researcher. I am a lawyer who specializes in international criminal law and in those international institutions. The title of this panel is What's Happening in Xinjiang Genocide? And what I am going to address in my remarks is my view that, yes, that we do have sufficient information to conclude outside of a judicial proceeding. And I want to be very clear about this, right? There are certain due process issues that you cannot make a legal determination outside of a courtroom. I'm speaking as a lawyer. I am not a judge. And it's very important that we all keep this in mind, right? So there is a limit to what I can say, but I do believe that there is sufficient information to conclude that China's forcible birth control policies against the Uyghurs qualify as genocide under the Genocide Convention, specifically Article 2D, measures to prevent births within the group with intent to destroy, in part, the group. So my remarks, as you might be noticing, are going to be quite legal. I told you that I have spent the past decade working at the International Criminal Court, and I will not be referring to the International Criminal Court for the rest of my remarks, because that is a different legal system. And we're not talking about individual criminal liability. We're not identifying specific perpetrators. We're going to be speaking about the International Court of Justice, its jurisprudence, and its interpretation as the body, the judicial body of the United Nations, of the provisions of the Genocide Convention. And as should be clear, in my remarks, I am only addressing Article 2D. That does not mean that I am excluding or discounting legal arguments brought under other provisions of the Genocide Convention. But I do believe that in a strict, conservative, legal interpretation, according to the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice, that Article 2D has been met based on the evidence around the population optimization policy of China being carried out in Xinjiang. A couple points, and I don't want to spend too much time going over this evidence because other speakers have addressed it, and I know that everyone is very familiar with what this policy is about. But there are just 2 points that I do want to highlight. First, one of the points that Dilner Rehan on the last panel made. Legally, motive and intent are not the same. The fact that China's motive is to change the ethnic demographic composition of Xinjiang, that is the motive or policy goal, does not mean that as a part of that, in order to accomplish that goal, that they do not have, and we cannot identify, the intent to destroy physically, in part, the Uyghur group. These concepts of motive and intent are distinct, and we are talking about intent, and the evidence of intent of destruction comes from the writings of academics and from the evidence put forward by government officials themselves as to the implementation of this policy. One of the most important points, I think, that has been or information that has come out about this policy is that the reduction of, and this goes directly to intent, is that the writings show repeatedly that the reduction of the Uyghur population's size and the reduction of natural population growth of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang is necessary in order to accomplish the policy goal of changing the demographics. That it cannot be accomplished purely by in-migration of the Han population, and because of ecological challenges, it is a critical necessary component of the overall policy to reduce the size of the Uyghur population. And this fact that it is identified as necessary to the overall policy, that this is laid out, is what we need to look at when we're talking about intent. Now, you've heard me say a couple times here, in part, and you've heard other speakers say this, I know, that the Genocide Convention provides that, and here just, I hope that I'm not being too legal, but I do want to make this really clear. When we're talking about destroying the group, we are talking about the mens rea. We're talking about intent. We are not talking about the act, okay? So we are not talking about, is there evidence that you have destroyed the group? Is there evidence that a sufficient number of people have been killed or under any of the other acts had one of those acts perpetrated against them? That is not what genocidal intent is about. The question is, do we have the underlying act? In our case, it is the imposition of measures to prevent births coupled with an intent that that act is being carried out with the intent to destroy. To destroy in part. What does that mean? Because this is actually incredibly important to understand what the legal definition is of in part. So the International Court of Justice has addressed this twice. In 2007, in the Bosnia v. Serbia case, and then again in 2015 in the Croatia v. Serbia genocide cases. What they have said is that in part means that it must be substantial. It must be of a degree that it impacts upon the group as a whole. However, I want to point out that unlike the ICTY, the ICJ did not endorse the language of the ICTY that the in part threshold requires that the destruction imperil the existence of the group as a whole. This is something that we can find in the ICTY jurisprudence, but it is not what the ICJ has yet said. What they have said is that it needs to be substantial enough of a part of the group to impact the group as a whole, which is a lesser than obviously threatening the existence of the group as a whole. Now, how do we analyze how to meet this threshold? There are three approaches that have been endorsed by the International Court of Justice. They come from the jurisprudence of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. The first is what is known as the numeric approach. The second is what is known as the qualitative. This is where it is a small group of persons who are being targeted, but they are particularly prominent leaders and carriers of the group's identity. And the third, which is also important, is what's known as the geographic with perpetrator control. And what that means is that you can have in part within a geographic area. So if we think about the Holocaust, for example, Hitler did not control, he may have wanted to, but he didn't control the entire world, right? And so we would find it ludicrous to say, well, there were Jews in the United States, that nothing happened to them during the Holocaust, so that must not be a genocide. No, what this says is that you can already begin looking at the question of genocide in relation to a geographic area which is under the control, essentially, of your perpetrator or state, right? And so that's why we can talk about Xinjiang, and we don't have to address or include the Uyghur diasporic community in a genocide analysis. Now, just to give you one example, oh, I see that I'm really running short, but just to explain, in Srebrenica, which I think you're all familiar with, the genocide, Srebrenica, the number of people who were killed, 7,000, was the equivalent of 1/5 of the population of Srebrenican Muslims, and the group as a whole that was being targeted was Bosnian Muslims. Because of the importance of Srebrenica, even though this represents a very small single-digit percentage of the Bosnian Muslim population, both the International Court of Justice and the ICTY, as I think everyone knows, has held that Srebrenica is, under the Genocide Convention and the statute of the ICTY, the crime of genocide under Article 2A in part. This should give us a reference point of understanding the amount that is actually needed when we're talking about in part. I see that I'm running out of time, and so I'm going to stop here, but I would just say that it's incredibly important to understand that under Article 2D, there is very little jurisprudence. We have never had a case brought or tried either individual or at the state level. And so this is a really important opportunity for lawyers, academics, to engage on the question of what does it mean to prevent births under the Genocide Convention? What does it mean, destruction in part? Because the law and the Genocide Convention must be able to respond to how genocide is actually carried out today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Erin, also for keeping to time. Now we have 11 minutes. Now, who would like to ask a question? Just raise your hand. Maybe we'll take 3 at once to speed things up. So I've got Joe, but anyone else raise their hand? Okay, well, Dr. Yen, Sense, anyone else? Any new blood, as it were? Okay, Joe, and then our Zenz.
Okay, Rune, I think you're a very brave man coming here today and saying what you said, and I'm delighted that you came, and yeah, however, my question is, well, first a comment and then a question. So China often reacts to criticisms of its policies in Xinjiang with whataboutist remarks. What about what the Americans are doing in relation to racism towards the black population, etc., to give one example? Is it okay for China to be doing now in the 21st century what European nations did some good long time ago because we did it back then?
We're going to take another question first. Zenz will ask a question. Okay.
Entirely unrelated question to David. I was very interested in your use of genocide by attrition, of FINE, and I understand that FINE defines genocide by attrition as a group being stripped of various rights, economic, political, etc., leading to a deprivation of conditions essential for maintaining health, thereby producing mass death. And I would just love if you could just elaborate if you're using this a bit metaphorically or a bit more literally, or how do you see FINE's definition of genocide by attrition in Xinjiang? If you could just elaborate, that would be great.
Third question, before I return to the panel. Okay. Oh, there's somebody. I was at the back, I missed that, sorry.
Is it actually possible that I reserve my question after hearing the response to Joe's?
Sure, let's do that. So we'll start with Rune.
You? Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very relevant question, and it's one of the starters, of course, of a debate, of a discussion. Of course, it's not okay to do what Western colonizers have been doing before, in part what they're still doing. What is going on in Xinjiang is in no way okay. It is grave human rights violations. It's colonialism. I would definitely call it that. I didn't really get into what else I would call it, but I think that's something we can reserve for a different frame of discussion. But grave human rights violations and colonialism and forced labor and so on and so forth. What I think is problematic about the genocide discourse is that it takes our attention away from a lot of analytical frames that we can use to understand the situation and that we can use to put the situation into a global perspective. And it focuses very much, especially the references to the Holocaust and the comparisons with the Holocaust that we keep hearing. It focuses very much on branding the Chinese government as particularly evil. I do think that they're evil. I do not think that they are categorically more evil than the American government, for instance, or my own government in part that has been very much implicated in the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, the Danish government. And I think we need to recognize these connections as scholars in order to not apply double standards. Also because we're not alone. People around the globe, also people who have been suffering from European injustice over centuries and decades, and colonialism and coloniality did not end after World War II. It's actually the structures is carrying on until today, and the whole neoliberal system is built upon it. So when people hear it and we don't really substantiate why we claim the Chinese government is particularly more evil or problematic than our own, then I think there's a problem. And I think one of the problems lies in our way of use of data. And I think that some of the people in this room rely on reports and rely on presentation of evidence that are not sufficiently nuanced and balanced to really make a good decision on these points. Because I think in a general conceptual sense, I agree with most of what has been said here today. And I do agree with trying to redefine genocide and look for creeping genocide and so on and so forth. I just don't agree with the combination of that and this strong categorical moral differentiation between ourselves and the Chinese, because I think it's being used geostrategically, geopolitically, and I see some of us making ourselves tools for that, and I think that's highly problematic.
Thanks very much. I think, David, you are the addressee.
Thank you.
The next question.
Thanks for the question, Adrian. What made me reread Helen Fine was the reports of Xinjiang under COVID, the way people were locked down and were reporting that they couldn't get access to supplies. So it was a permissive, I was worried about people that I know dying, not being killed by hand in camps and being attacked or targeted, but just being prevented from having access to the means to life. That was what attracted me to reread Helen Fine, but I did shift more to Claudia Card. I mean, she uses Helen Fine to say that's why we have to think of genocide as long-term. We can't say it started with the final solution. It started long before that. So that's what Card builds on, but Card differs from Helen Fine in saying, no, this is social and cultural first. Mass killings are a technique used to wipe out nations. They are not the subject matter in itself. All genocides are slow, and they begin usually with underlying narratives that I tried to bring out in my paper of dehumanization, that people are not, either not a real people, so modernizing them, i.e. eliminating their culture, doesn't matter because they're not real, or they're actually a threat. And yeah, just briefly to comment on the sort of debate that's going back and forth. I mean, I would argue the established I mean, I don't know what you mean by established use of genocide. I do think we need to be careful when who's established that, who you're siding with, because we are taking sides when we use language. When we say this word means this, because these people say that, we're siding with those people. I'm comfortable with that. I'm taking a political position saying I think genocide is wrong. That is a political position. I can't convince anyone of that through theory. That's my politics. I don't think you should eliminate cultures. And I think we should stop cultures from being eliminated. And that's why I'm drawn to that use of genocide. So in a sense, I'm comfortable with that taking of sides. So I want to know what side are people taking? What is someone's politics when they want to deconstruct a term, which I welcome, but the question is why that one and why this way? Because that's a political question. And I like the use of evil. That's Claudia Card uses that as well, and that this is, there's evil all around the world, but what is our role? Who are we? Am I a British person speaking to my British government to get them to do British things? No, I'm a person trying to convince my own government that this is important. Where does that fit into the anti-pro-China narrative? I would rather say this anti-pro-China narrative needs scrapped. It's been...
That was my point. Right?
So Erin would like to come in on this, but Rune, did you want to say something?
No. Go
Okay, Erin, and then we'll go to the next question.
Yeah.
And then we wrap up.
No, I wanted to just maybe say something to see if we can think a little bit differently about what I view as a not particularly helpful framework between this question of cultural genocide and quote unquote legal genocide, genocide under the Genocide Convention. And it's just to explain that what the rationale of why acts are criminalized is not because they are crimes. It is because of the harm that they cause. That is what leads the international community to say these are, for example, atrocities that shock the conscience. They cause such unbelievable harm that we criminalize them. We make them international. And the point about the loss of culture and the idea that because the Genocide Convention requires physical or biological destruction as an element, that somehow that this means that cultural destruction is excluded is actually not, in my view, at all correct. It is the core heart of the raison d'etre. It is why genocide is actually criminalized in the way that it is. And we can see this from Lemkin's writings, we can see this from the Genocide Convention itself. But just to tell you, as a lawyer, when we go through the process, right, you have a conviction, which means you are convicted of a crime. Then you have a sentence. And a sentence is about harm. That's about the harm that you have caused. And I'll just give one really easy example. Child soldiers is a crime to recruit a child soldier, right? But the harm and what a person is sentenced to is that that child has lost their education, they have lost their ability to socialize, they have been separated from their family, they have been raised in a violent, militarized environment. And those are the harms, and that is why children cannot be recruited into a militia or armed group. Even though loss of education, right, loss of family connection is not an element of the crime at all. It is why the crime exists under international law. And that is the same for genocide. That to simply say that when we talk about loss of culture, when we talk about loss of language, community, all of these things, this is the harm of the crime of genocide. It is not distinct, it is not separate. It is the core of the Genocide Convention and why genocide is referred to as the crime of crimes. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you very much. Have we got last question again? Yeah. So please ask your question nice and economically, and we'll have economical answers. Thank you.
Is this, I'm not audible? Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thanks to Erin for that important explanation, which I fully concur with. I think in the spirit of debate which Rune raised, I'll add these points as I understood what you said and turn it as a question. I understood your presentation and your subsequent remarks as essentially lament over three things. Poor scholarship, dishonesty, failure of integrity, and so forth. I share that very much. And I share that concern that, that there's a lot of scholarship which is lacking. We can go into it, but there are also real reasons why people are very concerned about the characterization, for example, of situations, because there are consequences in the material consequences, careers, many, many other things. For that reason, I have enormous admiration for those, as I think we would for our colleagues who stand up with constant integrity and endeavor to pursue the academic privilege and to speak with as much honesty as possible. So that I agree with you. We need, and that, therefore this debate which is not available, for example, in China. So this is a first point. The other two that I observed. Could you actually ask a question? Yeah.
Point.
Yeah, so that
they get to make a point, you get to ask a question, and then...
Yeah. So the question was going to be whether he concurs with this interpretation, because then maybe our debate gets closer, you see? So the other 2 points are actually about your laments of inconsistency and political use. And of course, all law has politics. Herschel Lauterbach said 90% of international law is politics. So of course this, and I share that concern too, is that really your concern? And the other one is inconsistency, because inconsistency does neither provide an excuse nor invalidate the law.
I would definitely agree with you on your first point, that it is about, I'm not saying that people are making or are doing worse scholarship than we would usually do, but it has become a lot more important to have critical discussion about it, and we're not having that critical discussion about it. And one of the reasons is the politics that looms over it. And for your second point, yeah, definitely. It does not, I mean, the law is still the law, and inconsistency is not a legal problem, it's a problem with us. I think we need to reflect on this inconsistency, and we need to choose a definition and a use of the term and apply it consistently across the board. And this is not whataboutism, it's about seeing justice in a global context and not just from one venture point. And I think as scholars, we need to do that. We have an obligation to do that, and at least to talk about it. I think it's good to have the discussion whether it's genocide or not, and I think it is a helpful discussion to have. So far, the evidence I have seen has been quite a lot, because I've interviewed a lot of former camp detainees, and I've seen a lot of the leaked evidence, even some of the stuff that hasn't been published or hasn't been shared publicly, and I don't think it is, but I have specific reasons for that, not general reasons for that I'm very happy to discuss with any of you in more of a closed sort of context, because as I said, I think having these specific discussions too publicly, again, can be utilized politically, and I don't think we want to go there, but I do want scholarly integrity, and I'm not saying we don't have that, but we're sliding away from it, and I would like to return to it. Maybe that will end up with me agreeing with you, that's very possible, but let's have the discussion, and let's get some of the facts on the table that do not make it into The Guardian or the New York Times articles, because they don't fit the narrative. And quite frankly, there are a lot of those. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rune. Apologies for the somewhat abrupt chairing, but I had strict instructions to turn on the killer attack dog inside of you all. So with that, we wrap up the session. My thanks to the speakers here and online. And Joe, have you got an announcement? Has anyone got an announcement? Joe.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Professor Moses and everybody today. Sorry that we've been a bit behind time today and there have been a few tech glitches, but I think all in all, considering the challenges we face in this COVID era, we've done quite well. Just to say that anyone going to the conference dinner, the Ottoman Turkish restaurant is within walking distance of the hotel. So just look it up on Google and you will see that it's within easy walking distance. In between now and then, we are going to the mosque, to Newcastle Central Mosque, to talk to the mosque community about what they can do to advocate for the Uyghurs. So if you would like to join us, again, just call yourself an Uber, tell them to go to the Newcastle Central Mosque and try and get there for 7 o'clock. Okay, I'm going to have to run now. Thank you so much. Thank you.